We are 18 days in, meaning we are in the 18th chapter of the book of Acts during my series, The Facts of Acts February, where I'm going through the whole book of Acts, all 28 chapters for all 28 days of February. And here in the 18th chapter, we see that Paul leaves Athens and he heads to Corinth. And while he's in Corinth, he meets a Jewish couple, and their names are Aquila and Priscilla. And this Jewish couple actually ends up in Corinth because the Roman emperor at this time has now forced all the Jews to leave out of Rome, more than likely due to all the mess that's been stirring up the spread of the gospel. But regardless, though, they are now in Corinth and they meet with him. And with them being tent makers, Paul also has a background in tent making, and so they decide to just kind of work together, and he works with them. He also stays with them. While he's working with them, he's also in the synagogue as usual, teaching and preaching the message of God, trying to persuade Greeks and Jews. And we find out that during this time that Silas and Timothy do join him in Corinth, and this intensifies his wanting to preach and spread the gospel all the more now that his bros are with him, backing him up. Of course, the pattern that we've recognized is that the Jews are always opposing Paul, and so they oppose Paul again while he's preaching, and it says that they even become abusive. Now, at this point, Paul has had it. He is done. He is over it. It says he shakes his clothes at them, which basically is like he's like dusting them off, and he tells them, your blood is now on your hands. It is no longer my responsibility. I'm just going to focus on spreading this to the Gentiles. And he dips. Now, he's not banning the Jews from salvation, but he's just switching up his strategy because the resistance in the synagogue has become just way too strong, and he's over it. During this time, Paul then moves next door to a Gentile who is also a God-fearer. And then we end up finding out that Crispus, actually a synagogue leader, also hears Paul's message and believes and is then converted. He gives his life to Christ. What's amazing is that this to me feels significant because we see that though Paul has this like moment where he's just over it and he's done, and he screams and tells them that you guys, your blood is on your own hands, we see that it was still effective. So even though they became abusive and hardened, it still reached some hearts, which is extremely important. So this is mentioned to highlight that his work at the synagogue was not pointless. It wasn't in vain. And that even after this rejection, there is a Jewish leader who decides to move forward with the message of God. This confirms that it bore fruit even before Paul decides to wipe his hands clean of the Jews at this point. And it says that many Corinthians believed and were baptized. Now, after this whole situation with the synagogue rejecting Paul's message and Paul's declaration that he's wiping himself clean of these Jews, God decides to visit him in a dream. In this dream, God encourages him that he's going to be safe, that he won't be harmed, and that he needs to stay there because the message needs to continue to grow in Corinth. Usually around this time, we've seen in the past that when things start to get a little sticky, Paul goes ahead and leaves and heads to the next place. But this is confirmation that God needed him to stay there because there was more work to be done. So unlike any of his other stays, he ends up staying there for a year and a half. Now, during this year and a half stay, of course, again, the Jews have to always stir up trouble. So at this point, they have decided to make a move on Paul and bring him before Gallio. This is the Roman proconsul of this area. And they accuse him of unlawful teaching. Now, what's funny to me is Gallio is like, what does that have to do with me? This is not a civil matter. This is a religious matter. So essentially, this has nothing to do with me. I'm dismissing this case. Now, this is where it gets crazy because they decide that since this wasn't good enough of an answer to them and that their case was just dismissed, they get so angry. And it's not necessarily clarified whether it's Jews, the disbelieving Jews, or Gentiles, obviously the ones who don't believe either, that do this. But they take the religious leader of this point, because now Crispus has gone on and he has converted, so he's no longer the religious leader. They take the religious leader at this point of the synagogue. I do not know how to pronounce his name. I'll put it on the screen. And they decide to beat him senseless. They beat him up in front of Gallio, and Gallio just watches and like, they don't got nothing to do with me. And he just ignores them. He's like, this is a internal religious Jewish matter. I don't care if you beat this man up in front of me. That means nothing to me. So I'm just sitting here just mind boggled by this. And then it just goes on to the next section of the book. But it's just crazy to see how things are unfolding and how reactions are being stirred up by the enemy to cause so much violence and wrath when he doesn't get his way. Moving on. Now, after the year and a half, Paul then leaves Corinth and he takes Priscilla and Aquila with him. They stop at Cenchrea, where he goes to cut his hair for a vow that he made to God. This is significant because it shows that he's not doing away with Jewish practices. He chooses to do them voluntarily with whatever it is that he feels led to do at that time. And it doesn't disregard his faith in Jesus, but it also doesn't disregard his historical roots as a Jew. So they get to Ephesus, and Paul does teach at the synagogue there, but it's not for long. He actually makes it pretty quick, and they do ask him him to return. He said, if it's God's will, then I'll come back. Paul does leave Priscilla and Aquila back in Ephesus, and this is where he decides to move on to Caesarea and then Antioch. This is essentially ending his second missionary trip. After some time, he decides to start traveling again, and then he ends up going through Galatia and Phrygia, and here he strengthens more churches. Then we get introduced to a new disciple, and his name is Apollo. The Bible describes Apollo as this eloquent teacher, and he's from Alexandria as well. Now, he arrives in Ephesus, and he is teaching accurately about Jesus, but he only knows about up until John's baptism. So Priscilla and Aquila, they do find him, and they take him privately to teach him about the rest of the gospel. And then he goes to Achaia, I think that's how it's pronounced, but he goes there and he teaches with more understanding now that he knows the gospel in totality and in its fullness, and he's proving from scripture that Jesus is the Messiah. That is chapter 18. I am loving this series, and I will see y'all all tomorrow.